and it's difficult for us to go and visit museums now. How can we bring museums to the homes of people via Zoom? And this is the third in that series, and I'm really delighted that MAP and you have agreed to do this for us. I want to start with a short introduction about your very illustrious career in art and in working with museums, and then I'll hand the floor over to you. This session is being recorded, so we will take questions towards the end, but I'm hoping that people can also reach out to you post the session if they have other doubts. Kamini has a very different entry into museums. She started off as a journalist and as a television anchor. She was the bureau chief for NDTV in Mumbai and one of India's leading news channels, where she reported on her whole range of events, both political and cultural. And from then on, she went on to head the Jahangir Nicholson Art Foundation, one of the most premier private collections of modern Indian art. And then at the CSMVS Mumbai, which was formerly known as the Prince of Wales Museum, she was very instrumental in bringing many institutions together in collaborative projects. And that's been one of her really special skills, which she's putting to very good use at MAP as well, in terms of connecting people who are passionate about art in different ways together, so that from that connection, different new creative ideas and thoughts and events can emerge. You've done some fantastic work and exhibitions in collaboration with the Tate in London, FOAM, Amsterdam, the Duke University, Durham, and the KNMA in New Delhi, and many, many more. And you were also a recipient of the Brooks Fellowship at the Tate Modern in 2014. So very, very illustrious career, and we're really happy and honored to have you here today. We're particularly interested with the MAP Museum because it has a very different collection of objects. Dakshina Chitra is largely about traditional South Indian poems and the beautiful things that they had as a part of daily life. MAP has a very different collection, and we hope today you will not only talk to us about the very different parts of the collections that you have, but also your own commitment for bringing people together who are interested in art, and therefore making museums a more fun place and a more creative space as well. Thank you, Kamini, over to you.
Thank you so much, Pradeep. Good evening, and it's lovely to see a few old friends here today. I'd first like to say thank you to Dakshina Chitra and to Debbie Tyagarajan for inviting me to talk about MAP and to share some of the stories from our collection with you. So we have a presentation which I'm going to pull up. Thank you, Ria. So let me begin by giving you a little idea of what MAP is all about, because I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with us. We are a new museum in the city of Bangalore in South India. And our mission is really to take art back into the heart of the community and create a museum-going culture. Because today the joke among the staff at MAP is we have the most crowded cities in India, but the emptiest museums. So we're really hoping that along with other similar institutions in Bangalore and across the country, we're hoping we can do something to change that. So this map gives you an idea of where we are located. In the heart of town, close to 2 metro stations, opposite beautiful Cubbon Park. We are positioned on one of the arterial roads in the city so that we are easily accessible. So this is an artist's rendering of the MAP building. Construction is still underway. We were meant to open in December. Can you hear me?
Yes, Kamini, loud and clear.
Okay, great. So as I said, we were supposed to open in December of this year, but the second wave of COVID clearly had other ideas. So we are now looking at an opening in the middle of next year, provided we do not have a severe third wave. But inclusion and accessibility really are what I would like to describe as the 2 pillars of MAP. And we are working on how to be accessible to people with not just physical, but also mental disability. So we're really fortunate that it's a new building. It's a small new space. And so from the start, we have sat down with our architects and our consultants, DIOC, which is the Diversity and Equal Opportunities Center, so that we can work together to try and make everyone feel welcome at MAP. So, you know, right from the start, looking at the ramps, what are the wheelchairs that we have to take people in, what are the surfaces of our lifts, are they matte and not shiny so they don't disturb people with certain mental conditions. And all of this goes for our website as well, because we use certain fonts, certain colors and contrasts so that they are friendly to people with visual disability and they find it easy to navigate our site. All our events have subtitling and sign language interpretation for the hearing impaired. Well, we see MAP as not just a space for object, but a place for ideas and conversations that we initiate through this collection. So the collection becomes a catalyst to grow MAP into a kind of cultural hub where there's plenty of interaction and exchange. And this is where storytelling becomes important. We're really looking to transform the museum experience for people. So let me just give you a sense of the collection. It's loosely divided into 6 different categories of objects. So we have pre-modern, modern and contemporary, textile craft and design, living traditions, photography, and popular culture. So what we are trying here to do is to collapse the hierarchies between what is perceived as high and low art. So we don't look at the collection in vertical silos, but we rather try to draw connections across the collection. We are one of the few, if not the only museum in India that has popular culture as part of the collection. So the idea is that people from different backgrounds, races, religions, all feel that some part of their life or culture is reflected here. And so they're able to connect. So when we talk of accessibility, we need to examine the relationship that the museum has had with audiences. And I mention this particularly in the context of storytelling, because traditionally the museum was seen as the voice that best understood the story and therefore was in the best position to tell that story. Today, we know that's not necessarily true because curators, art historians, scholars bring knowledge and learning to what they do, all extremely valuable and important. But that is one aspect of the story. When we deal with objects that have, say, cultural, religious, or traditional significance, there are several layers of knowledge and storytelling. This could come from members of the community, specific practitioners of that ritual that the object is associated with, worshippers, craftsmen involved in its making, and so many more. And that is why we see the relationship with our audiences and stakeholders as a very collaborative one. Okay, so let's get started with the highlights from the collection. I will begin with objects from the pre-modern era and then share the more extensive range of the collection. So from the earliest cave paintings, storytelling has been an integral part of our lives in all cultures and all parts of the world. Even before we had text, we had poetry, legend, folklore, myth. So take a look at this folio from an illustrated Bhagavad Purana. It depicts one of the oldest forms of sharing stories that we have, oral transmission. The Bhagavad Purana is a sacred Hindu text, one of the 18 great Puranas. And in the left half of this painting is entirely devoted to establishing its preeminence. This is a royal setting. So at the center sits the Srimad Bhagavad on a golden throne, studded with precious stones and topped with the royal chhatra or parasol. So like a sovereign, presiding over the sabha of courtiers or the other 17 Puranas in this case. On the right register, the focus is on how this celebrated text was transmitted across space and time. First by Vishnu himself, who instructs Brahma, Brahma, who in turn conveys it to the divine sage Narada, and onwards from Narada to Vyas, Vyas to his son Sukadev, and lastly, Sukadev to the king Parikshit. And additionally, one may reflect, with the passing of the ages, eventually from the manuscript to the reader, the artist Salir Ram to us. On to now a sculpture of Brahmani that dates back to possibly the 10th century. This Brahmani comes from southern Karnataka, most likely in a region ruled by the Nalamba dynasty. Brahmani, as her name suggests, is related to the god Brahma, and they share many of the same attributes. Most distinctively, Brahmani has 4 heads, though only 3 are depicted in this sculpture. She also holds a rosary or akshamala and a water pot or kamandulu. We see these two objects in her upper hands. She holds her lower right hand in a gesture of protection and reassurance, Abhaya Mudra. We are not quite sure of the object that she's holding in her lower left hand, though it could be meant to represent a lotus pod. This hand is held in the gesture of generosity, Varada Mudra. So Brahmani belongs to a group of 7 or 8 goddesses known as the Matrikas or mothers. They are not mothers in the conventional sense, and there are many stories about their origins. One of the most common is how they came into being to help the supreme goddess Devi in her fight against the demons Shumba and Nishumba. Many of the Matrikas, including Brahmani, are female counterparts of male gods, and they share many of these gods' attributes. For instance, Vaishnavi relates to Vishnu, Aindri to Indra, and so on. The Brahmani's curvaceous body is decorated with bracelets, necklaces, and other jewelry, which follow conventions of idealized female beauty and the importance of adornment. Despite the gentle appearance of Brahmani, Matrikas also have a fierce side. In Puranic traditions, they defeat demons on the battlefield and then drink their blood. So they're a blend of Ugra and Saumya, ferocious and gentle. The combination of threatening and alluring qualities. So you better be careful about which qualities of the goddess you incite. Okay, so the map collection has some beautiful textiles, and I would like to share some of them with you. This rich purple brocade skirt is really one of my favorites. If you look at it carefully, it has so many little stories to tell, maybe about the person who wore it and the master craftsman who made it. Banaras is considered to be the home of brocade in India, but this intricate, almost embroidery-like weaving style is found in different parts of India, including Gujarat and Rajasthan. So let's try and imagine who was the lady who wore this skirt. What was she like? Judging from the richness of the brocade, she was probably a wealthy woman from the upper class, likely to be politically conscious and maybe nationalist. And let me tell you why we think so. This skirt or lehenga was made in the beginning of the 20th century at a time when India was struggling for freedom. So look closely at the complex patterns above the skirt's border, and you will see the hidden meanings that emerge from its motifs. So within the sunflower pattern, you will see the map of an undivided India, reflecting the desire for one nation. The idea of a single Indian nation imagined through cultural unity and aesthetics. This skirt tells the story of the makers, dyers, pattern makers, and weavers who wanted perhaps to contribute to the fight for independence and how they found a way of doing it. Since the British were very quick to clamp down on any form of resistance, you had to be very creative in your messaging. It's also interesting to see how Western fashion influenced traditional Indian dress in the early 20th century as a result of colonialism. So a brocade silk sari has now taken the shape of this panel skirt. I want you to look at something else. The elaborate silver zari weaving on the silk. Tendril patterns swirl around palmette motifs with the winding vine, the bell-shaped flowers that are slightly open. These resemble European Art Nouveau and Art Deco designs. So the artisan and the pattern drawers were able to translate their wealthy patrons' knowledge of Western art movements into traditional Indian garments. The sense of fashion, style, and political consciousness all rolled into one. Another interesting textile that I'm going to share with you is one of our kantas. Women in Bengal express and shape their personal identity by embroidering on old worn pieces of cloth or kanta. Every kanta is converted into an accessory which further becomes a keeper of women's secrets. Kanta as an art form is special because the women sit together and communicate with each other by perfecting the kanta stitch. They complete each other's doodles, plan symmetrical flowers, and openly depict their hopes and fears on cloth. Kanta is powerful. Every motive, stitch, color, of thread, and the technique has meaning. The art historian Stella Kramrisch very insightfully describes the 8-petaled blooming flowers in a kantha as an entire universe that's contained within it. So this kantha quilt that you see is immensely creative. If you look at the central flower motif, you will find that the maker's name, Ananda Sundari Bhaumik, and another name, MC, whom the kantha seem to have belonged to, inscribed between the petals. The maker combines a whole lot of disparate elements that seem to have had an impact on her. You can see angels wearing saris, women grooming themselves in the Kalighat style of painting, lions resembling coat of arms. In spite of all the innovative elements, the artist retains a central flower and the paisleys and buttis in the corner. Staying with, I think, a bit of Bengal and maybe a bit of Tamil Nadu, I'd now like to introduce you to a sculpture that demonstrates the intricate craft of making pith from the shola plant stem, which also had a functional purpose. It was used to make headgears for bridegrooms, as well as dolls, garlands, idols for worship. The lightweight shola stem was adapted by artisans in many ways, particularly in the late 20th century. So shola pith is a craft that is practiced largely in Bengal and Tamil Nadu. This is because the shola pith is made from shola that grows in these wild, marshy areas. And the farmer also plays his part in this craft, taking care of the plant, making sure it reaches the right height so that the artisan can carve it perfectly. So while the use of shola pith was reserved for religious purposes, it was only in the late 20th century the craft was made accessible to everyone. So this sculpture is interesting not only because it is carved out of a natural and sustainable material, but also because of the carving of the man and the woman, which is so realistic. You know, just look at the drape of her sari, the swirl of the pleats, the creases on his trousers. These details are painstaking work and quite difficult to achieve. The woman wears a nose ring or a nath, indicating that she is married, while the man holds a sword. So they look slightly towards each other, almost like a high definition photograph. While I was earlier talking about drawing, you know, on the knowledge of the community, I had in mind objects like this Bhuta mask. Bhuta Kola is a form of spirit worship that is practiced in southern Karnataka. It is a centuries-old practice that is still performed today, where local spirits or deities are channelized by ritual specialists. So these ceremonies are very significant for the community because traditionally family and village disputes are referred to the spirit. Also matters of political justice or even the legitimizing of political authority. So the annual Bhuta Kola festival is the highlight of the calendar in the Tulu community. Bhuta Kola in the local dialect means the play of the spirits. So in such ceremonies, men wear animal masks and no longer remain mortal, but are believed to be possessed by the divine spirit. These spirits then sing and dance all night long and answer questions through the men who have received them. This is the Bhuta mask of Pili Chamundi. In Tulu, Pili is the word for tiger, and Pili Chamundi is worshipped for the protection of crops and cattle from tiger attacks. So the bulging eyes, the flaring nostrils and fangs are further indications of the spirit's ferocious and powerful nature. So these annual ceremonies are important to the communities even today and can involve either small gatherings of a family or an entire urban district. This is another artist whom I find really wonderful, Buribai. She's an artist, illustrator, and muralist, born in the mid-60s in the village of Pittol at the border of Gujarat and Madhya Pradesh. She was the first woman from her community, the Beals, to paint on paper and canvas. So Bhils are India's largest indigenous group. They live in parts of Madhya Pradesh, Maharashtra, Gujarat, and Rajasthan. They have their own language and cultural practices that include various art forms such as the Pithora mural painting ritual. So historically, a Pithora mural is painted on the walls of homes by male head priests who are also referred to as artists within the community. In contrast, few women painted and their work was considered decorative and not accorded the same value. So as a child, Buribai would watch the painting ritual despite young girls not being allowed to, and even began painting the mud walls of her family home. She is not only the first in her community to paint on paper and canvas, she is also the first Bhil woman to gain recognition for her independent talent as an artist. So this painting is part of a series that MAP commissioned. The works are autobiographical in nature, and each painting narrates specific instances from Buribai's life. So when she was just 7 or 8 years old, she, along with some of her friends, would take the cows and buffaloes out to graze in the jungle, like all young children then in their village. So this painting illustrates that scene. The footprint on the rock belongs to Jhama Mata, a local goddess who appeared on this spot and left a permanent impression of her foot. So Buribai would often sit on that rock and watch the animals graze. So close to the rock is a stream. And when the currents were strong, she would hold onto the tail of the family buffalo while crossing the stream. And the painting, if you look at the bottom, the painting shows her doing just that. So Buribai's paintings have this very lively visual vocabulary that is driven both by an autobiographical and an archival impulse. You know, she draws from her encounters with flora, fauna in the forests surrounding her, motifs from traditional tattoos, and later from her experience and travels as a contemporary artist. Okay, we now move on to our popular culture section and explore this trade label. So businesses today use branding to attract customers, but textile labels with their colorful imagery were some of the earliest forms of advertising and graphic design. These labels tell us about a very active trade that was happening between India and Britain in the 18th and 19th centuries. So bales of cotton were being shipped to India from the mills of Manchester. And every bale had these labels pasted on them. So they were usually rectangular and marked by borders. The borders had the name of the mills or the agents. They were an integral part of the publicity campaigns of both British and Indian mills of the period. And they had imagery that ranged from the mythological to the political. This textile label depicts scenes from the Ramayana. In the lower part, we see Sita by the threshold, protected by the Lakshman Rekha. And Ravana depicted with his 10 heads, he's attempting to lure her out. Towards the top of the image, you see Ram and Lakshman hunting the golden deer that Sita had desired. And Marich, the deer, was a ploy used by Ravan so that he could lure Ram and Lakshman away and then abduct Sita. So religious themes were used by these manufacturers to subliminally suggest religious sanction for their products. So MAP has a significant collection of over 5,000 Bollywood posters, lobby cards, film scripts, booklets, and different kinds of other ephemera. And aside from their use as promotional material, these posters have also become objects of study because they reflect social, political, and cultural values of a society, of a community. In the history of Indian cinema, women were often slotted into certain roles and stereotypes. The ideal wife, the ideal mother, the vamp who functions as temptress or courtesan. So they were often objectified or seen as accessories to their male counterparts. So look at this poster from the movie Aurat. It codifies certain gender stereotypes through the representation of its male and female protagonists. So the actor Prem Nath is seen at the top, aggressively fighting off a lion, while Beena Rai lounges at the bottom, resting on a bolster cushion in a yellow dress that bears her midriff. So on the other hand, the depiction of fearless Nadia with her iconic whip in Hunter Wali Ki Beti represents a departure from the stereotypes of the demure lady or the vamp, thankfully. So some of us might be familiar with Nadia, but for those of us who are not, Mary Evans, known as Fearless Nadia, was born in Perth in Australia in 1908. And she was one of India's first stunt actresses. Her 1935 film Hunter Wali, produced by Homi Wadia, whom she later married, was the first to showcase her fearlessness, athletic prowess, and her talent for the stunt genre. Yet Nadia's ethnicity raises questions. It was acceptable for a white woman to play such a character, but would it have been acceptable had an Indian woman taken on this role? I really wonder. I'm just going to take a drink of hot water because my throat is troubling me. On to photography now, and we have a wonderful collection of map from the 19th century when photography came to India, moving up to contemporary times. So this is a photograph by Raghu Rai, who's one of India's most celebrated photographers. He began as a photojournalist, and over the last 50 years, I would say he's captured some of the most definitive moments and events of our history, from scenes of war, portraits of political leaders, to the lives of everyday people. He presents both the beauty and the brutality of life. This iconic photograph was also taken in Delhi in 1971 at a stepwell called the Ugrasen Ki Baoli. It's a historical landmark located in the heart of the city. It's composed with such a sense of artistry. The boy leaping off the edge of the ruins of a monument, the hands outstretched, his body arched, just moments away from the water. We also see the juxtaposition of the tall modern buildings in the background with this ancient structure of the well. A single frame captures these two worlds that coexist, the old and the new sitting side by side, trundling along amicably, and sometimes not so amicably. While the well remains intact even today, it no longer holds water and has become something of a tourist attraction. So Rai's photograph also invokes this sense of nostalgia of a time that was. New Delhi would continue to be the backdrop of his photographs for several years, through which you can trace the city's development and its changing landscape. This is an outstanding work by Anoli Pereira, an artist who was born in Colombo, but divides her time now between India and Sri Lanka. She's an important feminist voice in contemporary art. Her work engages critically with themes ranging from women's rights, history, issues of identity, colonialism, and post-colonial anxieties. I Let My Hair Loose protest series discusses the politics of the gaze and addresses the portrayal of female subjectivity or how a woman perceives herself and her role in life. I find this series quite riveting. It was inspired by childhood memories of her grandmother's house, looking perhaps at the photographs of her female ancestors on the walls, and then gradually developing a fascination for old photographs. So Anoli's photos depict their sitters in formal poses, looking directly, almost expressionless at the camera, very much like studio portraiture of the early 1900s. These female protagonists seem to be dressed up to resemble Sri Lankan women of a bygone era, perhaps mimicking the women that she has seen in old family photographs. But by recreating similar portraits, she, in contrast, depicts her female subjects set in domestic scenes, facing the camera, but with their hair covering their faces. So hair becomes an important symbol within the series. alluding perhaps to Medusa's hair. Hair seen out of place often signifies hysterical, uncontrollable, maybe unpredictable behavior. She uses hair as a protective veil to arrest the male gaze. So by covering the face with it, she obstructs the viewer's voyeuristic enjoyment of the female subject. The title includes the words let. I let my hair loose, perhaps conveying that the subject of the portrait retains control and the power of choice in allowing the male to see only how much she wants him to see. We now come to our last section, which is our modern and contemporary one, with a work by a seminal figure in the modern Indian art space, Arpita Singh. Her career has evolved over 6 decades, beginning with her early black and white abstracts, then moving to watercolors, before shifting to oil on canvas in the 80s, the medium of her most dramatic works. Women, usually in different phases of their life, have been central to her practice, whether absorbed in their daily routine or entwined in these mythic narratives. She creates a world of everyday objects with sharp brushstrokes in this characteristic pink and blue tones. But this is abruptly disturbed by violent imagery that is often lurking on the edges of the canvas in the form of guns, tanks, or malevolent figures. So in Arpita's work from 1986, we see some of the same motives that keep recurring in her work. If you look in the foreground, there is the reclining woman gazing outwards. The floral motif on her dress and on the upholstery of the chair create this very domestic scene. There are 2 ghost-like figures that float above her, and squeezed in between them is a man and a taxi. And this is an image that recurs in other paintings, even 2 decades later. So all this would seem like a fairly cozy scene until you notice the gun. And suddenly the room is transformed into a claustrophobic chamber of captivity. The chair with its cheerful patterns casts this dark shadow on the wall, perhaps suggestive of the plight of women in Indian society today. Singh is able to achieve this sudden transformation of the experience by the way she handles perspective, part of her training in miniatures, from where she also learned how to build her narrative skills. And I'd like to end with one of the highlights in the map collection, Krishna Eating the Fire, a work by the artist Manjit Baba. Just look at the way he uses color, the flat application of this rich red, the simplicity of line and form, elements that he borrowed from the Pahari miniature tradition. He worked to create a language that was uniquely his own within an Indian idiom, one that drew on the Indian tradition of storytelling and this wonderful bank of myths and legends that we have. So at a time when our modernists were drawn to the more understated colors of Western art, such as browns, grays, ochres, his canvases were pulsing with these bright reds, yellows, and blues that were part of the Indian palette. So Krishna Eating the Fire reflects an important development in Baba's artistic career, as it marks the appearance of the very characteristic figural form that began to emerge in his work in the 80s. These rounded, fluid, and almost boneless figures with gentle facial features that defied gravity on canvas. So this painting recalls a popular legend of Krishna swallowing a forest fire, which is also narrated in the Bhagavad Purana. So as a child, Krishna often visited the forest nearby with all the other cowherds. And on this occasion, some of them drifted off into an adjoining forest, and they are soon engulfed by the raging fires. So on hearing their cries for help, Krishna rushes to the forest, and in order to protect the gopas and their grazing cattle, he instantly swallows the fire, another manifestation of his divinity. So I'll end on this lovely Manjit Baba painting. And yeah, Pradeep, that's the end of our presentation.
Fantastic, Kamini. Thank you very much for this virtual tour. Love the fact that you looked at everything possible. I mean, we looked to start with miniatures, and we went to folk bronzes, we looked at folk art, we looked at movie posters, cloth labels, pith work, and we ended with contemporary art as well. I'm going to throw the floor open to questions in a couple of minutes, and I know we're rushed for time. We end at 7. But I'd love to hear a little bit about your passion of bringing people together and making them work creatively. What have you been able to do much of that at MAP so far? What's your journey been like?
We're really actually looking to see that this is a very inclusive space. And the tragedy is that when you mention museums in India, most people want to run away. If you gave them a choice of saying, where would you like to go to? Would you like to go to a restaurant? Would you like to go to the theater? Would you like to go to a mall? I can't see anyone racing to the museum. So we're really concerned about changing that whole perception, the experience. We want to give people a new experience, to tell them that a museum is a place where you can have fun, where you can learn something and enjoy yourself. So how do we do that? Because most people don't understand why a museum is relevant to their lives. They see it as a place with dead objects. Who cares? But each object there has a story. So how do we unlock those stories and get people to understand what is the relevance of that object to my life? Because when we look at objects and our history, we understand where we came from. Why do we behave the way we do? Why do we eat the things that we do? So it's those objects tell us about our past. They tell us definitely about our present, and they also give us clues to our future. So I think the onus lies on museum professionals to draw those stories out and to help people connect them to their lives. Because I think people need to understand that art is not something in museums and galleries. Art is about the way we live. Art is in the rangoli we draw on our doorstep. Art is in the way we drape our sari. Art is in the way we decorate our puja rooms or our churches or our mosques. So we want to reestablish that connection with the community.
Absolutely. I think the point that you made about women wanting to express themselves, the attention to detail in the Shola pith work, and working with such a fragile medium, all of these are important competencies, as it were, even for us today, right? We need attention to detail. We need to find ways to express ourselves. We need that creativity, the nuance of working with different materials. All of these things are important. So I'm glad you've been able to bring that out together. And I think at Dakshina Chitra, we've been able to do a lot of that with the events that we have, with the folk dances and the things like that. But we have our problems as well, right? We're a little further away from the city. It is on a very well-connected road, but the same problem is there, that how do we get people to come in when they have the choice of going to a pub or whatever it is. So really, really happy to hear your thoughts on that. If there is one big idea that you want to execute for the year or two ahead, what would that be from now?
Actually, there are several ideas, Pradeep, because we look at ourselves as a kind of a space for ideas, really. And there are so many that we've been working on during the past year. Some which are still in the process, some which have happened. And one idea that I really like to share with you is the one that we worked on with technology, because we live in the tech capital of the country, and we believe that this is, if we want to connect with young people, then we have to speak their language. We have to speak the language of the digital native. So we have been developing a lot of technology initiatives, especially with 3D holographic experiences that we're creating. So we have the 3D holo table, where you can pull up images that perhaps are not displayed in the museum, but if you come in and you want to see a highlight and it's not being exhibited just then, you can pull it up, see it in detail, go into the little, it allows you to really come close, and so you can see details of the signature. The conservators can look at it closely if there are any details to be looked out for. And one of them, when we said we're living in the tech capital of the country, we said also, why don't we look at how we can engage with the tech community? And so MAP Labs at MAP was born, and that looks at the intersection of the arts and the sciences. So how can we use technology to provide art solutions? And our first initiative was when we reached out to Accenture, and they created for us a 3D persona of MF Hussain, because we said he is one of the country's best known artists, most renowned artists, and young children today will not know about him. So, so Accenture actually used artificial intelligence, and based on all, they studied a whole series of interviews that he had done right through his career. And so we provided them all the content, and we were able to stitch this too. So it's really like a digital twin. So anyone who walks into the museum can have a chat with Hussain, ask him a whole lot of questions, and it's like this 3D persona that you're talking to. Now, since it's ready, and since the museum, physical museum opening is delayed, we decided to take it online, and we took it online, but it's not quite as exciting as it is. But I don't know, Ria, do we have a small clip of that to play?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, it'd be fun to look at it.
We could get away with asking for his autograph, huh?
You could
not get it, but we can still ask.
Yeah.
What is your name?
You can call me Hussain Saab, but my full name is Maqbool Fida Hussain.
How old are you?
Want to take a guess? As of today, I am over 100 years old.
Are you real?
As close to real, enough to impress you. Please ask me, what do you need to know about me?
Yeah, so that's how it builds up a whole lot of questions then, and you know, and you can kind of chat with him. So we thought it was important for young people to have that experience.
Fantastic. So I'm going to throw the floor open to questions if anybody has.
If there are no questions, I can always tell you about some of the collaborations that we do. I don't know, what are people interested in hearing? Not very sure.
Kamini, can I ask you a question?
Of course. Oh, Nalini, nice to see you on this.
I really enjoyed your talk and the various kinds of exhibits and examples that you showed.
Mm-hmm.
You know, one of the things that MAP could do is invite schools to bring their senior students, because visual art and design has become now a subject of choice for examination and beyond. And there aren't too many museums in the country that invite students. So since you have such a fabulous kind of building, inviting school children is when you will sow the seed to learn a bit more. And of course, with artificial intelligence and all the various new techniques one has, I think will take them a long way. So,
yeah. Thank you so much for that suggestion, Nalini, because, you know, education is really fundamental to what we do at MAP. And what we had already done was reach out to the community before the museum had even opened. So we've been doing education programs for about the last 3 or 4 years, because we wanted to, that was a way of being able to engage with the community even before the museum has started. So telling them about us, saying that this is a new museum that's coming to the community, it was our way of connecting with them. And so what we did was we had a whole series of workshops that we were doing with children from different backgrounds, different schools, different age groups. And we would curate a sort of small exhibition, you know, on various topics, which would not be a kind of drawing, painting kind of thing. But these exhibitions were meant to stimulate creative thinking and critical inquiry, so that they would get children to think and interact and learn through art. Unfortunately, the pandemic put paid to the workshops in the physical space, so it took a bit of time for us to take everything online. But we have now, and so what we are doing in the online space just now is we have a series called Discover Map Packs. So these are a whole lot of learning series based either on themes, on artists, different kinds of learning or themes. And children can download that along with their parents from the comfort of their homes, so they can they can enjoy that. And we also are developing 2 learning channels. So, and this is being done with where we engage with children, and children also contribute to the learning process and the content for these channels. One channel is for educators and one is for children. So it's jointly developed. We involve them as well. And we're starting with a session of 8 episodes for the first season, and then building it forward, going forward.
Fabulous. So it's like it's like a walk down the history lane for them.
Yeah.
Just makes it all come alive for them.
Exactly. We would love that engagement with children in schools directly.
Yeah, do that, because otherwise it's so boring for them to learn through just a textbook or a kind of one-dimensional picture.
Yeah.
So
Thank you for that.
I think that would be a good thing for you to do.
So these download packs, Kamini, what kind of content would they have?
For example, we have one on Jamini Roy. So it takes you in a beautiful way through the kind of work that Jamini did, but relating it to a child's life so that he sees the connection. What is the techniques he used? How is it picking out did he use a cat with a fish in its mouth? How do you engage children with that kind of imagery? And then it also becomes interactional because it has worksheets that you ask children to work on, and so it's about a whole series of about eight or 9 sheets that you download and then work on. And what we're also doing, Pradeep, is we are trying to develop a M&E tool, a monitoring and evaluation tool, because here we're developing all this content, but what impact does it have on students?
Yeah.
We really need to know that. So we had this collaboration with GenPact, and for the last year, we've been developing this monitoring and evaluation tool. And so it's now at the pilot stage. We still need to roll that out. We're just waiting for a safer time once COVID, the pandemic eases, because we need that interaction, that physical interaction.
Yeah.
In the pilot phase, at least.
Fantastic.
Hi, ma'am. I'm Erin, and I've been following your website and also reading your blogs, Map's blog. And I've been a big fan. Honestly, I think your team has put a really good effort in figuring out authentic information. So I want to know the process that goes behind you deciding on writing on certain topics and the sources that you refer to and the way you put out to the public, point number 1. And second, I see that you have a very updated technological involvement in furthering your using objectives. And I would like to know your vision and ultimately your dream as to how you would want this process to end or to flourish. Thank you.
Okay, so what is the kind of content? See, when we look at a museum and we look at the kind of objects we have different kinds of objects, we have different kind of audiences. In the beginning, we were looking at, we said we want MAP to be a space for everybody, and that really is the vision for MAP, that this becomes one of the most accessible and inclusive spaces in the country where everyone is welcome at MAP. But where do we start? And in the beginning it was everybody come to MAP, but when you were looking at the programming and the messaging, we found that was so difficult because we were all over the place then. So then we sat down and tried to say, okay, where do we start? Let's first look at people who are engaging at least at some level with the arts, then start engaging with that group, then start taking it out further. Let them be the ambassadors for MAP and slowly build our audiences going step by step. Because if you suddenly say, I want everybody, you're not able to create the content, because we really think about the content that we put out. So we look very specifically at the target groups that we're looking at, the age groups, likes, interests, and see what can we do to interest them. For example, if we're looking at young people. Now, young people would not look at art in the traditional way. So then we decided to do a program called Tattoos and Taboos. So how do you look at what are popular trends in society? And how do you link that into the art in the collection of MAP? So you're looking at tattoos and children today love to use tattoos, but these are traditions that existed within communities, and it's so much a part of what we have in the collection at MAP. It was practiced by traditional communities for so long with beautiful designs and things that had a certain meaning. So it's so interesting for people to look at how their current practices intersect with older cultures. So it's bringing that connection to young people. And then we look at the older section as well, or people who are more interested or more deeply interested in the arts. How do we create? So we have programs like the Deep Dive, which looks at what do people who are deeply interested in the arts, what do they want to see? So then we talk to scholars and researchers from across different museums or different institutions, looking at particular developments there. How do we bring those? How do we make MAP a window into what's happening across the world? Or I do a program called Director's Cut, which interviews directors from different parts of the world. So I interviewed one director from Argentina. I will be interviewing another director from Benin. I interviewed Cecilia Alemani, who's the director of the Venice Biennale this year. So different kinds of people. We try and bring different kinds of programming to people.
Thank you so much, ma'am.
Super. So thank you very much, Kamini, for doing this for us. And we'll put this up on social media anyway, the recording, and I hope that those of us who have questions at a later point of time, or want to look at some kind of collaboration, can reach out to you through your website and your social media handles. We really look forward to that, and all the best for you to start all your programs, and let's not worry about the third wave at this point in time too much, at least.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure to interact with the audience, and I'd invite you all to engage and come to MAP when we open.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Kamini. Okay then. Bye-bye. Thank you.